Okay.
We are going to get started.
Perfect. Elias is going to admit everyone.
So we can give the most time to our speaker. Welcome to everybody here and to everybody who's attending online. There were over 700 people registered for this lecture. It is really with the greatest pleasure that we inaugurate today the McGill Palliative Care National Grand Rounds Series. With the generous support of 9 local hospital foundations and Pallium Canada, we intend that this initiative builds on the historic contributions by McGill University to the field of palliative care by providing a novel means to disseminate the latest innovation, research, and ideas in our field to places across Canada and beyond who may not typically have access to the types of speakers who typically present within the walls of our academic institutions. With the generous support of the McGill University Health Center Foundation, we begin with a lecture named for Dr. Balfour Mount, who is here with us today and who coined the term palliative care. Dr. Mount and colleagues opened the first hospital-based palliative care unit at the Royal Victoria Hospital 50 years ago today. And on the occasion of this inaugural Balfour Mount lecture, we have the pleasure of welcoming one of his most important collaborators and friends, Dr. Michael Carney, who Dr. Richard Cruz will introduce momentarily. To acknowledge the land on which this lecture is given and to walk us through some of our accreditation-related information for this lecture and the lecture series, I would like to introduce my colleague and the National Grand Rounds Course Director, Dr. Stephanie Gingras.
Thank you, Justin. The scientific members of this committee and their relevant declarations include Dr. Justin Sanders, who has relationships with Maison Saint-Raphael and the American Society of Clinical Oncology, and who has received honoraria or grants in recent years from the Oklahoma University of Health Sciences, the Oregon Health Sciences University, and Pancreatic Cancer Canada. Dr. Arjuri Tsimikalis, who reports a relationship with and grants from the Shriners Hospital for Children. Dr. Olivia Nguyen, who reports relationship with la Société québécoise des médecins de soins palliatifs, and a research subvention from la chaire de la famille Blanchard pour l'enseignement et la recherche en soins palliatifs. Dr. Naomi Goloff, who reports relationships with the Canadian Society of Palliative Medicine and grants from the Kindred Foundation and from l'Association québécoise de soins palliatifs. Dr. Zelda Freitas, who reports grants from the Center for Caregiving Excellence and relationships with Nova Montreal. And finally, Dr. Janelle Walsh, Dr. Aurel Schuker, and myself, who report no affiliations with relevant organizations. Okay, where are the sponsorship? I missed it.
Yeah, there you go.
This is the one. Okay. This series includes sponsorship from the Cedars Cancer Center Foundation, the Hope and Cope Wellness Center, the Jewish General Hospital Foundation, the Montreal General Hospital Foundation, the Montreal Neurological Institute, the MUHC Foundation, Palliative Canada, the St. Mary's Hospital Foundation, the Montreal Palliative Care Institute, Teresa Delar Palliative Care Residence, and the Montreal Children's Hospital Foundation. Here we present a strategy to mitigate potential bias. The overall program learning objectives are as follows: to review innovative approaches for the implementation of palliative care in different settings, to assess strategies to address the most important challenges in palliative care today, and to appraise the latest research in the field of palliative care. I would like to welcome Dr. Richard Cruz, former Dean of the McGill Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences. To introduce our speaker today, Dr. Cruz is a distinguished Canadian orthopedic surgeon, academic, and medical education pioneer, a companion of the Order of Canada, an officer of the National Order of Quebec, and a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. Dr. Cruz is renowned for his groundbreaking work in medical professionalism and medical education. Lesser known about Dr. Cruz are he and his late wife Sylvia's important contributions to the field of palliative care. 50 years ago, they were instrumental in supporting Dr. Mount in his efforts to establish the program at the Royal Victoria Hospital. Dr. Cruz was also a founding member of the McGill Council on Palliative Care, a leading advocacy and palliative care volunteer training organization in the Montreal area. Welcome, Dr. Cruz.
Thank you very much. I guess you can guess that not much in this world will give me more pleasure than being here today. My association with BAL and palliative care, and they are synonymous, goes back forever. And it's been one of the more meaningful things that's happened to me. I'm also absolutely delighted to welcome Michael back. And I'll cover the word back a little bit later. Michael's one of the pioneers of palliative care medicine. As with so many others, he traces his origins to Dame Cicely Saunders. He was active in Dublin, has now been in Santa Barbara, filling important roles in end-of-life care in that area. But he really has been a power in promoting end-of-life care, and I think in the concept that end-of-life care and healing are almost synonymous. That certainly has been the feeling that most of us have had. And that's where I get to back. Michael was here when we were involved in devising a new curriculum at the undergraduate level for McGill. That curriculum is still present, and frankly, I think is one of the gems in McGill's crown. Our approach to undergraduate education doesn't emphasize humanism or anything. It emphasizes healing. We started out with a focus on professionalism. We had a concept that physicians in their day-to-day lives fulfill two separate roles, the healer and the professional. And of course, when we started, because Sylvia and I were interested in it, we emphasized professionalism. One Dr. Mount came up to me and said, you know, you talk about the healer and the professional, but you're only teaching professionalism. We should do something about that. Now, Michael was here communing with Val at the time, and Val suggested that we have a committee on healing, co-chaired by Michael and Val. And the results of that committee are today's program on healing within McGill's curriculum, which is almost unique, I think, in the world. Not many other places look upon healing as something that must be fostered in the curriculum. And it really has become who we are. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Michael, a power in the palliative care movement, but someone for whom we at McGill have to express great, great gratitude because he has helped form us into who we are. So Michael?
I feel very humbled. And Dick, thank you so much for that introduction. And just to start, I'd like to also thank Justin and Stephanie and Devin and Karen and the scientific committee for this honor and this invitation to be here today. It's truly a great honor and very deeply meaningful for me to be here. Val, so happy you're here. Val is a dear friend, a close colleague for a number of decades now. Our paths having first crossed in Dame Cicely Saunders' office some 50 years ago, probably around the same, well, it must have been before the palliative care unit opened. So maybe more than 50 years ago, and I'll say a little more about that anon. But I felt, throughout my career in palliative care that I've just been very blessed, very lucky to be in the right place at the right time, as on that occasion, but on many occasions throughout my career in palliative care. And I'm most deeply grateful for the fun and creativity that Val and I have had in collaborating throughout the years. I really consider Val my dear brother in palliative care. And so I hope to cover quite a lot of territory fairly quickly. So I'll begin, and I would like to begin by just quickly going through my disclosures. I am a member of an advisory board for the nonprofit Mindful Heart Programs. The learning objectives of my presentation are to analyze the concept of healing and argue its centrality in the palliative care mandate. I'm going to talk about strategies for fostering healing in our patients and their families in palliative care. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about a model of what I refer to as deep resilience, or self-care 2.0, as something that I feel is valuable, perhaps even essential, for those of us who want to stay in palliative care in a sustainable way and an enjoyable way for the long term. And in terms of the CanMeds framework, I'm going to be touching on, I think, in different ways, these different competencies: professional scholar, health advocate, communicator, collaborator, and leader. So let's begin. Oops, there's one slide that has disappeared, but that's okay. So it's 1974, and I am a disillusioned medical student, and I am halfway through my medical studies, and I sit with a mentor one day, and I tell him how I'm feeling, and he says, well, before you leave medicine, which I was contemplating, visit St. Christopher's Hospice in London. His sister happened to work there part-time as a hematologist. He said, visit St. Christopher's Hospice. It's a place of healing. He used that phrase, it's a place of healing. And there was something in that phrase that piqued my curiosity, resonated, such that I reached out and found they were running a one-week training, and I was able to go and be part of that. And so that was in 1974. And by the end of that week, I understood in some deep way that perhaps I couldn't have put into words at the time, how this was a place of healing. I couldn't have said what healing was, but I somehow, I think, deeply understood. So that kind of confirmed, well, I then knew what I wanted to do, and that was hospice medicine, as it was called at the time. Val hadn't coined the phrase palliative care. Palliative care didn't exist at the time. So I went back, finished my medical studies, and I trained in internal medicine, did a residency in internal medicine, as Dame Cicely advised me to do. And then she allowed me to come back and to work at St. Christopher's. And so I went back in 1980, and that's me in the background, and that's Dame Cicely in the middle. Formidable lady, as those of you who've met and know her, you know, the heart of a lion, but doesn't suffer fools gladly, and just needed that edginess and determination to really create the revolution in healthcare that she created. She created the hospice movement. So I was lucky to be there, and I was there on and off over 10 years. What's at the very heart of hospice? What inspired Dame Cicely to move on from being a nurse to a social worker to a physician to working with a group of people to open St. Christopher's as the first modern hospice, was an encounter with a young Polish man, David Tasma, who you see here, who she was sitting with one day as a social worker, I believe at the time. And she said to him, David, what can we do for you? And this was, you know, he was at the very end of life. And he said to her, I only want what's in your mind and in your heart. And she took that as the phrase that in a way launched the hospice movement and created what she referred to as not tender loving care, but effective loving care. With all that modern medicine, social work, psychology, chaplaincy, all, you know, so much of it research-based could bring. And so as I kind of have worked at St. Christopher's, one of my other big takeaways was really that it wasn't just about what we as clinicians know or what we as clinicians do, that it's about how we do what we do. And Cicely Saunders puts it like this, that the way care is given can reach the most hidden place and open space for unexpected development. So the way we do what we do matters. In 1987, palliative medicine was recognized as a medical specialty by the Royal College of Physicians in London, the first country to recognize it as a specialty. I was working in St. Christopher's at the time. I'd been working at St. Thomas's with their team, which Dr. Thelma Bates had started called the support team in palliative. It wasn't, again, that was before Bal had termed the phrase palliative care. So I was lucky to work there for 3 years, then came back to St. Christopher's for 3 years as an attending. And that was really valuable. That was really important for the kind of, you know, as I say, by then Bal had the first palliative care unit had opened in 1975, I believe it was, yeah. And palliative care was really in the currency and the language of medicine, but actually recognizing it as a specialty gave it an authority within the eyes of the medical establishment that has been so helpful, I think, in it becoming as included and widespread and integrated into healthcare as it now is. Virtually every hospital in North America now has a palliative care team and a palliative care service. But I was worried, and I wasn't alone in this, in the early days of the specialty, that in our excitement about being welcomed into the fold of medicine in a sort of you know, in a kind of recognized way, that we could sacrifice a little bit what I felt was at the core of palliative medicine, the core of hospice medicine, now palliative medicine, that we could become over-medicalized. And that's what I kind of just said in the opening paragraph. It's argued that palliative medicine may be in danger of developing into a specialty of symptomatology. Such a specialty would be confined by the limits of the medical model and its particular view of illness. The potential for physicians working in palliative medicine to go beyond symptom control to creating conditions where healing at a deep personal level may occur for the individual patient, and the practical and personal implications of this are discussed. And that's what I did in the article. And so that created a little debate and at the time, and there was kind of pushback, and Professor Sam Ahmedzai, professor of palliative medicine at Sheffield University, wrote this article in Progress in Palliative Care in 1997. He said, ultimately, suffering from losses, lack of love, existential doubts, as well as poverty and cruelty are not medical issues, and the response to them is not necessarily the responsibility of any healthcare discipline. The view now within palliative medicine is that it's okay to be a symptomatologist and proud of it. So, so there was this creative back and forth. I continued to think about this, and in 1996, published a book called Mortally Wounded, which really explored a concept called soul pain, which I defined as the emotional existential anguish that we experience when we're cut off from the depths of ourselves. And I really advocated in that a holistic approach, a whole person approach, if you like, that combined biologic evidence-based medicine with my big interest at the time, which was in depth psychology, and particularly through working with the imagination, with image work and music therapy. I continued that exploration and actually found, as I did my research, that really what I was tapping into were the very roots of Western medicine, that a place of healing, working with suffering in Living and Dying was published in 2000. And what's at the core of that is working with our innate healing potential, a recognition that within us as individuals, within our patients as individuals, there is an implicit innate healing potential. How do we work with that in a collaborative way? And my particular focus in that book was on working with dreams and recognize the value of dreams as an expression of that innate healing potential at the end of life. And so it was really kind of going back, as I say, to the very beginnings of Western medicine, to ancient Greece, the Greece of Hippocrates, and indeed of pre-Hippocrates, because prior to Hippocrates, for about 500 years, there was the ritual of temple medicine, which was based around Asclepian healing. The Epidaurus in the Peloponnese is the center of Asclepian healing. And this is the great amphitheater there, where to this day they still perform concerts, Greek tragedies, and then in the background you can see the remains of one of the healing temples. There are many of them there. So this was a place in the natural world, a place of beauty, a place close to nature, a place where the arts were an implicit part of it, a place where there was usually flowing water in some way for bathing and exercise and good nutrition. But the central event, the central healing event in Asclepian incubation was dreaming. So when the time was right, the patient, the incubant, was led into the abaton, which was the sleeping quarter close to the temple, or indeed it might have been in the temple floor. And whatever dream they had that night, whatever dream was seen as a visit from the God of healing. The dream was the healing. The dream was an epiphany of healing. And so I just felt, yet here, at the very roots of Western medicine, and we still see it, in the caduceus, which is kind of seen as a sort of a symbol of medicine, we see the two serpents. And indeed, Hippocrates himself, with his focus on biological evidence-based medicine, which has become modern medicine, saw his role as complementary and intertwined with the healing, the awakening of the innate healer within the patient. That was at the heart of the Asclepian tradition. But there was an important recognition there that I took with me into into my understanding of healing, and that is that unlike preventing disease, unlike curing disease, we don't heal another person. As David Finley puts it here, we do not heal another person. The most we can do is to prepare and hold the space where the miraculous may happen. And so back to St. Christopher's. 1974, coming to the end of this wonderful week, which kind of reaffirmed my desire to become a doctor and to follow the healing path, the path of healing. At the end of the week, each of us on the course had the opportunity of meeting with Dr. Saunders in her office. And so I knocked on her door and I heard in her booming voice, "Come in." Maybe it was just "come." And so I went in and she was sitting at her desk with her glass of sherry, and sitting next to her was a young man. And she said, "Let me introduce you. This is Balfour Mount. He's a Canadian surgeon, and he wants to bring what we're doing here back into the acute hospital setting." And that's where our paths first crossed, those 50 years ago. And so, you know, Bal coined the phrase palliative care, 1975. I didn't realize it was, whatever this is, January the 21st. The first palliative care unit opened in the Royal Victoria Hospital. And what Bal and I have really shared in common, I think, and collaborated on in different ways, is the belief that healing is at the very heart of our mandate in palliative care. That even as our body falls apart, it is still possible to find healing, that it is possible to die healed, as Bal puts it. Recognizing psychologically that part at the core of our task, not just as psychologists or chaplains, but also, I believe, as physicians and nurses, we're caring for a frightened, dying ego that drives a lot of what we see manifested, a lot of what appears as symptoms, physical and psychological. And that part of what we're doing as we go about doing our everyday palliative care is we're creating the conditions for healing. And we do that through whole person care, another phrase of Bal's. Oops, stopped advancing. Let's. Oops. To see if I can go back one. Yeah. All right, that's working. Good. Thank you. So yeah, at the core, I think, of whole person care is psychoanalyst Michael Baylant from the Tavistock Clinic in London. In his book, The Doctor and the Patient, writes that we are the medicine. And he's talking to doctors. We are the medicine, but this goes for all clinicians, all caregivers. We are the medicine. We are the most powerful medicine that we give those we care for. We are. Not what we do, not what we know, but who we are. And back to how we do what we do. So Bal and I, our first writing collaboration, Bal, I believe, was for this chapter on spiritual care of the dying patient in the Handbook of Psychiatry and Palliative Medicine, which was published, edited by Harvey Chochinov and William Breitbart, and published in 2000. And in this, I think, Bal, this is where you maybe first used the phrase whole person care. You said, we're advocating whole person care. Recognition of the rich potential this embraces challenges us to re-examine medical education, to consider what whole person education for doctors might look like. Our thesis isn't that doctors must become competent in the area of spiritual distress, but that all doctors must be aware that existential issues are intrinsic to the experience of illness, that the issue of spiritual pain is an important consideration in establishing each differential diagnosis, and that such issues need to be recognized and attended to by the multidisciplinary team. So in 2001, life brought me to North America, and I moved from working after a wonderful 13 years at Our Lady's Hospice in Dublin and helping to establish a palliative care team at St. Vincent's Hospital in Dublin, I was, as I say, carried by life to the States. Now, one of the consequences of that move was that my 25 years of medical experience wasn't recognized here. So I had to go back to medical school, had to do my USMLEs, had to do a second residency in internal medicine, which was actually pretty good because it was like a mid-career intensive, which was actually very valuable. But while I was doing that, I was blessed to be invited by Bal to be part of, as Dick referred to, this group, the McGill Faculty Working Group on Healing in Medicine. And Bal and Dick and Sylvia and I and others met over a 2-year period from 2002 to 2004, considering questions a bit like I'm considering today. What is healing? Is it part of our mandate as physicians within medicine? Indeed, if so, what are the implications for our practice, for education and research? And in March of 2003, we published our report, and our recommendations were 3: that we have some didactic input on what is healing, is it part of our mandate, the sort of reflections we're sharing this morning. But I think key to our recommendation was that medical students going through medical school would keep a journal, a portfolio, and this would be for ongoing self-reflective charting that they would keep throughout their 4 undergraduate years, documenting their personal thoughts and feelings about each encounter they had, that would include the dreams they had that night, you know, after a kind of an intense encounter, perhaps with a patient or a family. So would really include the subjective experience of the medical students. And then that there would be small peer review groups where they would meet throughout their 4 years to share their experience as much as they wanted to. What we were hoping for here, I think, I hope I've summarized it right, but was a sort of Trojan horse effect, you know, that if we really could find a way of integrating the subjective lives of medical students into training, perhaps we were cultivating whole person clinicians. And that if we want to see whole person care, we need whole person clinicians. Bal and I published an editorial in Palliative Medicine in 2003 where we summarized our findings and where we described healing not as an entity, not as an endpoint, but as a process and as a relational process. That healing has been defined as a relational process involving a movement towards an experience of integrity and wholeness, which may be facilitated by a caregiver's interventions, but is dependent on an innate potential within the patient. It's not dependent on the presence or the capacity for physical well-being. It's possible to die healed. I was very lucky, again, to be in the right place at the right time. So in 2005, I was beginning my residency for a second time in internal medicine. Just at the moment, a palliative care team was starting at Santa Barbara Cottage Hospital, which you see here in Santa Barbara. Very beautiful place to work, and I've been very blessed to work there over the years with a wonderful group of colleagues who I still work with. When I started working there in 2005, when I was starting work with the palliative care team, I had I think I kind of came in from the point I'd left Ireland, where I was at the verge of trying to set up a healing center based on the Asclepian healing temples. I had a wonderful hospice board that I was working with at Our Lady's Hospice who supported the idea. And we'd actually got to the point of fundraising for this healing center where we were going to offer a combination of, if you like, the Hippocratic and the Asclepian. So I came with those ideas, but you know, it just wasn't possible to do that depth work that I had been able to do in Dublin, where I had a bigger team to work with. I was the sole physician on the team, and we were already becoming very busy. And it wasn't what was needed. It wasn't what they were employing me to do. They were asking me to do this sort of bread and butter palliative care that we do every day. and also to manage a hospice home care team, and also to manage an inpatient hospice, and also to set up and establish a home palliative care team. So I was just busy. You understand the word busy. And it wasn't what was needed. So for a while, I kind of, in a way, I kind of had to shelve that a little bit. And maybe at some level, it felt like a little bit of self-betrayal. I don't know. But anyway, I didn't have a whole lot of choice around it. It's not what was needed. Everyday bread and butter, pain and symptom management, being a symptomatologist, working with a team, a wonderful team, I might say, who I'm still working with. And then in April of 2007, one of the things that kind of heartened me and kept me going was that Bal, with his colleagues, Pat Boston and Robin Cohen, published this paper, which I still feel is one of the most important papers that's been published in the field of hospice and palliative care. I think maybe underappreciated, but it is the paper on healing connections, on moving from suffering to a sense of well-being. Now, many of you may be familiar with this, but if you're not, here's a brief summary. This was a purposive sampling of 21 participants. So Bal and his group collected 21 participants, 10 of whom were identified as experiencing existential anguish, and the other half of the group, 10 or 11, were identified as experiencing actually wholeness, and were rating their quality of life as really good. Whereas those that were experiencing existential anguish were rating their quality of life as really bad. I'm putting it very briefly and succinctly for the sake of time. But what distinguished, how that existential anguish manifested, they interviewed the patients and then they looked for common factors in that group. And what came out was those that experienced existential anguish were those that were feeling disconnected, that had a lack of meaning, they were either preoccupied with the future or the past. They were feeling a victim to their disease, and they had a desperate need to stay in control. Whereas those who were experiencing wholeness and could relate to that and feel that that accurately described how their experience, felt that they were experiencing connection, they did have meaning, they somehow had found a capacity to be peaceful in the moment. They had a different kind of relationship to their illness, more sympathetic, less adversarial. And they were able to choose their attitude to adversity. They said, we don't feel in control, but we feel we still have choice. What made the difference? What made the difference about whether you ended up in one group or another? It was the presence or absence of healing connections. And what were healing connections? Healing connections are a sense of bonding, and they identified 4 areas. A sort of an internal sense of bonding to ourselves, an external bonding to others, family, friends, community, connection to the phenomenal world, to nature, through the senses, to music, to great art, through the body, yoga, exercise, or a connection to ultimate reality, however that was understood and meaningful for that individual, religious practice, prayer, meditation. And here's a couple of paragraphs from the discussion that pull it all together. A sense of meaning was evident in those who were able to find a sense of well-being and wholeness in facing serious illness, whereas a sense of meaninglessness was common to those experiencing suffering and anguish. What seemed increasingly evident to the interviewers was that meaning wasn't an end in itself, but a byproduct of a related experience, a sense of connectedness. So it wasn't meaning per se, as some sort of entity in itself that brought the person alive, but the underlying experience of being part of something greater and more enduring than the self. So in 2008, that same year, I was invited to write an article for the Journal of the American Medical Association with a group of colleagues, including Bal and including Mary Vachon from Toronto, the nurse researcher who's done a lot of work in burnout and self-care, and also Richard Harrison, who's a psychologist in Vancouver, and my wife, Radley Weininger, who's also a psychologist. Self-care of physicians caring for patients at the end of life. And so I'm not going to go into that article now, but I just wanted to say that On the night before I sent this article in to the editor at JAMA for the final time, I was reviewing one last time the symptoms of burnout. Overwhelming physical and emotional exhaustion. Feelings of cynicism and detachment from the job. And a sense of ineffectiveness or lack of personal accomplishment, never quite getting that sort of quality in my work, maybe that I used to get or that I'm hoping to get, always feeling falling slightly short. And it was like, check, check, check. That was literally the moment that I recognized that I was burnt out. And there was a certain irony that wasn't wasted on me, because here I was advocating, you know, how to mitigate burnout, how to prevent it. I was doing everything we were recommending in our article. So why was I burnt out? I was practicing what I now see as kind of basic self-care. And in our article, we talked about self-awareness-based self-care. So we combine basic self-care of protection in the stress and restoration outside the stress, combine that with mindfulness and self-knowledge, and it's even more potent. I was doing all of that. I was doing self-care 1.0, and yet I was burnt out. I reflected on that, and I realized part of it was because I'm one of nearly 2/3 of physicians who are experiencing some degree of burnout, perhaps unrecognized. This was a huge meta-analysis done by Lisa Rotenstein and her colleagues on the prevalence of burnout among physicians. It was published in JAMA just before COVID in 2018. It was a meta-analysis of 182 studies involving 110,000 physicians, 45 countries, over a period of time, many years, finding a prevalence of burnout of 67%, or 2/3 of all physicians. In my particular case, after some reflection, I realized the reason I was burnt out was because day in, day out, at that stage for about 30 years, I had been exposed to other people suffering and pain. And even though I'd been in supervision, and even though I was practicing mindfulness, and all of that, despite that, and even though I spent time in nature and did the sort of things we were recommending for self-care, I was burnt out. But I was burnt out because I did not know how to be with my own pain. And over time, it had taken a toll. And that set me on a search, sort of an interior search, if you like, that went on for a couple of years, that led me one day to standing at the side of a creek, looking into a pool, holding a question, why am I, you know, the question I was holding was not why am I burnt out so much as, is there another way to be with pain that's not going to burn me out over time? And I found myself at the edge of a stream. I looked in and saw this circular shape. I looked more closely and I recognized, my goodness, it's a bird's nest in the stream and the water is flowing through it. And I realized then, and I wrote about this in a book called The Nest in the Stream, that the nest in the stream was pointing me towards another way of being with pain, my own, others, and our worlds. And if I was to kind of paraphrase that, if I was to imagine the nest talking to me, here's what it would say. You don't have to be afraid of your pain. You're feeling the pain because you're connected. Pain is a sign of how connected you are. So it's okay to feel what you're feeling, but you don't have to hold on to it, or you don't have to push it away. You can simply let it be, and you can let it flow through like a nest in the stream. And I realized, though, that I could only do this if I knew, and not just conceptually, but experientially, that I was held like the nest in the stream, in a deeper stream, in the flow of a deeper stream. So what do I mean by that? Well, here's another story. It's the early time of COVID. I was lucky enough to have a little writing cabin up in Big Sur in California. I was working on a book. I used to drive up there. This is where I used to spend my time among the redwoods, the California redwoods. And that was in August 2020. I next got to go back there in December of that year, in December 2020. And in December of that 2020, when I went back there, this is what I saw. I saw this, a decimated, burnt out landscape. And I walked around a corner and I saw this. this charred, huge redwood. It was about 6 foot plus across in diameter, broken mid-trunk, lying on the ground, just charcoaled. I presumed it was dead. I didn't have an opportunity to go back to Big Sur for 18 months, but when I did, this is what I found. That redwood stump had not just survived the fire, it had become a forest itself. As you can see, it was blooming from its trunk, from its root base. How do I understand that? I understand that because the redwood was rooted, because its roots weren't damaged by the fire, because it was rooted in something deeper than its surface self, because it was tapping into that deep web that pulls the whole forest together, the mycorrhizal web. So that for me is what I mean by deep resilience. That's a metaphor for deep resilience. That's a metaphor that is about being rooted in depth. So what roots me in depth? It's a metaphor for being rooted in what's truly life-giving. It's a metaphor for what being rooted in what matters and what is meaningful means. That's what I mean by self-care 2.0. So we need both. Self-care 1.0 only works if it's rooted in self-care 2.0. Why is this important? It's important because this fosters regenerative sustainability, allows us to stay present, the capacity to stay present with an open heart, not closed down and shielded and protected, but present and engaged in a wounded world. It affects our quality of presence. And I just want to say a few words about this. This is Robert J. Lifton. And Robert J. Lifton, great psychiatrist, I think he's now 98, still alive. And I was lucky enough to be, in my early days in hospice, sitting in a group in London in a hotel conference room, listening to Robert J. Lifton, along with 100 or so other hospice workers. And he turned to us and he said this. He said, you in hospice care, you talk about your patient's quality of life. But what's the quality of your life? Because that's the quality of presence that you bring to the bedside. And that concept of QOP that could go along with QOL, I think is so important. Is this the quality of your life? Is this the quality of my life? Coping, surviving with the necessary kind of trials of everyday living? Or is this the quality of your life? And how can we shift our basis of operation? How can we come to the bedside more like the redwoods, more like the sequoia than here's another quick metaphor that might help. If you put that spoon of salt into a glass of water and taste it, it's undrinkable. If you take that same spoon of salt and you walk to the end of this walkway and you put that spoon of salt into that mountain lake, you don't taste it. These are two different ways of being present to suffering. We can be present to suffering as the individual glass of water that holds it with the best possible intention. But over time, that takes a toll. Or we can hold another's suffering as a mountain lake, whatever that means to you, how you come into that sense that from little self into big self, if you like, into deeper self. So how can we do this? How can we become a wild mountain lake to another's suffering? And this is a question for each of us to ask and to answer for ourselves. But I think here might be a useful question to ask yourself, what for you is a relationship, a place, an activity, a practice that situates you, that roots you in a bigger, deeper context than what Alan Watts calls your skin-encapsulated ego? What, in other words, brings you into your healing connections, to come back to Val's and a colleague's term? And how can we tend and deepen these? So back to where we are. I'm still walking these corridors, now part-time, but I'm still working with the team. I'm still doing bread and butter, palliative care and hospice. I'm working with a wonderful team, including social workers, chaplain. We don't currently have a clinical psychologist. We have in the past, but mostly nurse-based. So we're very much a nurse-based program. But I'm doing the everyday bread and butter, but I'm now doing it with almost as a kind of a mantra, not that I'm saying it to myself, but with an understanding that I can only survive the relentless tsunami of suffering that long-term work in palliative care involves. If, like a nest in the stream, I can let it flow through me. That doesn't mean not feeling it, being present to it, but it just means not holding on to it. It means letting it be and letting it go. My feet rooted like a redwood in what isn't afraid and what doesn't die. An understanding that the more we abide in depth and in healing connections, the more we become a place of healing for ourselves, for others, and for our world. There's a line in one of the Psalms, and that I trust, that deep calls to deep in the roar of waters. That if I can be a field of care, that if I can be a place of healing to myself, that somehow resonates with that place of healing, that place of care within the individual, which is already there, but under the clouds of suffering and distraction. So now I say, it's okay to be a symptomatologist and proud of it. If I do, if I remember and live what Cicely said all those years ago, the way care is given can reach the most hidden place. So one last moment, and this is a book I was reading recently. It's essays previously unpublished and lectures of Viktor Frankl called Embracing Hope. And on page 89, Viktor Frankl says this: now there is one last question. What happens when, for example, someone else dies and the transience of another human existence is at stake and at issue? Well, famous urologist in the US, you got that one wrong, but, but Canada, who led a World Congress in Montreal about psychology in the final stages of life, therefore in people who are dying, once wrote, the end of life is always a time of unparalleled potential for personal and interpersonal growth, for the patient and for the family. And this is true. And so in finishing is that palliative care is a place of healing, that it's not something we do as another task. It's more about remembering the inner healer and the inner wholeness that is already there within us, but also within all our patients, within everyone. It's about realizing that we are the medicine, that we become this more fully, and it becomes more impactful to others by abiding in depth and in healing connections ourselves. This brings deep resilience, but it also empowers us to become a healing presence to others. Our patients and their families then experience themselves being held in an effective and loving field of care. Thank you.
We welcome questions now.
Comments, reflections, please, Dick.
Yeah, I thought I was past the age of asking questions, but I'm not. I'm going to suggest an addition to your talk. In the literature on burnout, there are several articles talking about the importance of a loss of sense of belonging. And it's easy to transpose that into your roots. We have thought and actually written that the theoretical approach to education called communities of practice should be applicable to this. Individuals voluntarily wish to join communities of practice, medicine, palliative care. In doing so, they accept the hierarchy and rules, they acquire the identity of the individuals there, and they have a sense of belonging. And we have thought for some time that one of the solutions to burnout is not so much with the individual, it's with the group to which they belong. And in order to do that, you need to invoke communities of practice and I'd be curious to see what you think of that.
No, I totally take your point, totally agree with you, Dick. And the book I was writing when I went up to Big Sur in 2000 and 2020 at the time was a book I didn't mention, but it's called Becoming Forest, and its subtitle is A Story of Deep Belonging. And it's sort of recognizing that that's another word for me, that's another word for deep resilience. So I think both works, and both can help us come into that sense of deep security and deep belonging. Either being part, really feeling ourselves part of a community, of a lived community. But I think we can also come in there by experiencing that inner sense of community. How when we go into depth, we lose that sense of individual self. We're no longer that glass of water. We come into that mountain. And so, yeah, absolutely. I think, and one can reinforce the other. So, yeah, thank you.
We have a question here on Zoom. Is there any benefit to bring our work home to our loved ones? What would be what would be a healthy way to do so?
Well, thank you for that. I kind of normally think a little the opposite. I and realize over time I've sort of practiced rituals around leaving work, taking off the time when I wore a white coat, which I don't do anymore, but I would take off my white coat. I would change into different clothes when I came home. I personally wouldn't talk a lot about my work at home. So in that sense, I think there's something to be said for having a good sense of boundaries between one or another. I think we were talking, I had a wonderful conversation earlier with a group of psychologists in the psycho-oncology group here. And we were talking about how, yes, it is about the inner work, but it's also about community. And it's also, it's also about that burnout isn't just an individual event, that if things are going well and communication is good and we have that healthy balance, that healthy work-life balance, that's really preventative and I think mitigates and is protective. How much, I'm just curious to know what's behind that question and whether how much we share of our work and of our feelings. I think it's really valuable to have a place where we can do that. That's why over the years I have had, I've worked with a counselor, I've worked with a therapist, I've been in kind of supervision settings where I've been able to talk about some of what I bring home with me in terms of feelings. I think what I found is that if I've had a really traumatic day at the office, so to speak, and I don't in some way deal with that, process that, then I can be snappy and grumpy at home. So I think it's important for us to think about the transition. I'm not sure it's the best thing to really kind of debrief over the dinner table with the, besides confidentiality, but just with the emotional side of it all. But there's definitely a value in having a setting where we can really kind of process those feelings, whether it's individual or a group setting.
We're going to have one more question. How do you think we can help young healthcare providers understand how to heal themselves? Many of this grow into this as we get older.
Well, I think what Dick and Val and others have started here, Don Boudreau and Abe Fuchs and all the group that were there at the beginning, just hearing that this group is still alive here. I actually didn't know where it was, how it had developed, but I think that is one wonderful way of doing it with, but I think this question maybe goes beyond medical students, but it also reminds me, I don't know if you remember this, Val, but before we even set up that working group, we had focus groups with first-year medical students where we sat with them in a circle and we asked those three questions, you know, what is healing? How do you understand healing? Have you an experience of healing that you can share with us? Everybody in that group, and we had picture postcards. We said, go find an image that speaks to you, what healing means to you. And people came back and shared stories and images that showed that they deeply understood what healing was. I remember Dick Cruz, who was one of our, or sorry, not Dick Cruz, Gordon Crelliston, who was one of our group. Gordon, he said, look, and this is where we were sitting down trying to put our summary together. And he said, he got up to a blackboard or a whiteboard, but he drew a vertical line, he drew a horizontal line, he drew another vertical line. And he said, look, this is entry of medical school, this is graduation. When medical students start their training, their understanding of healing is up here. Their understanding of cure and prevention is down here. By the time they graduate, their understanding of cure and prevention is up here. But their understanding of healing has gone underground because it's not being appreciated, because it's not being nurtured, because it's not being validated. So having programs like Dick mentioned, just really valuing, appreciating the subjective inner life, just realizing that it's about who we are and not just what we do.
Thank you, Dr. Carney.
So thank you so much, Michael. This concludes the inaugural Balfour Mount Lecture in the McGill Palliative Care National Grand Rounds series, sponsored on this occasion by the McGill University Health Center Foundation. We're so grateful to Dr. Carney for his wisdom and his time with us today, and to all of you attending here and online. We recognize that the QR code and the link to the evaluation is currently down. However, we will send this to everybody within the next week, along with information about the lecture, which will be published online on our YouTube channel and with Pallium Canada. We look forward to seeing you next month for the Montreal Palliative Care Institute of the Teresa Deller Palliative Care Residence sponsored lecture given by Joanne de Montigny, another pioneer in palliative care, and we hope you have a wonderful day.
Merci beaucoup à tous et à toutes et à très bientôt.